Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait a few minutes to let people arrive. But if you could introduce yourself in the chat and say your location, because I think we've already got people all over the country. And also, if you want to answer this question, what's one thing you think Americans get wrong about low-income white people? Cynthia Silva Parker, who's here, is active in the Boston chapter of the Poor People's Campaign. So I think um, we've got some Poor People's Campaign representation. So if you're just joining, the question is, we've already got quite an answer. What is one thing you think Americans get wrong about low-income white people? And someone says, Erica says, that we're all bigots and racists, assuming that all working class white people just make the worst assumptions. Yep, Suzanne, I like that you're identifying yourself as showing up for racial justice, one of the exemplary groups in the country about organizing working class white people. Yeah, Susan, that poor whites exist. M says the stereotype of being uneducated. Activists make the worst assumptions of low-income white people. Oh, no. Yeah. And Sam Coleman, who is always eloquent on this subject, that they're racist, that they have poor impulse control and no work ethic. Thank you, J.D. Vance. Oh, my goodness. All right, if you're just joining us, we're introducing ourselves in the chat by putting your location and one thing you think Americans get wrong about low-income white people. The stereotype thing, Judy, that they don't work hard and deserve their poverty. If everybody could stay muted, we'll open it up later in the session for verbal participation. But for now, let's just communicate through the chat. That they're only in Appalachia. That's good, Barry. Okay. Michelle, I'm seeing a request that we have multiple presenters share, but I think it's going to go better if I'm the only screen share.
Sorry, I don't even know what that means. I was just.
Hi, Michelle. Okay, it just popped up.
I got that.
I think you were maybe trying to mute yourself. All right, Mary Reagan, who identifies as white working class, that we are lazy, racist, and dumb. Yeah, I've heard all of those stereotypes, Mary. This is great. We're really setting up the topic here that of all these stereotypes about working class and poor white people. So keep them coming. Yeah, Cynthia says so many assumptions, including that no one who's working class no one who's middle class was ever poor or working class. Yeah, we forget about people's class backgrounds. And oh yeah, thanks, Dennis. The word trash is never appropriate for a human being, right? Not educated, they like their situation. Thank you, Dr. M. We're still seeing people coming in and getting into the waiting room. So we're gonna wait a couple more minutes. Michelle says they're lazy, mentally ill, and on drugs. Okay, somebody's not muted. Yeah, I think we'll all have an easier time hearing. It might be you, Shell. No, you're muted. Yeah, I think we'll have an easier time hearing our guest speaker and talking to each other if you can stay muted when you're not actually speaking. Oh, Nicole, the prosperity gospel. I bet we're going to hear some real different points of view to that today. Great. when they want us showing up in a demonstration or activity as mere tokenism. This is just great. I'm really glad we asked this question because there's clearly a lot of thoughtfulness in this group here. So let's get going. But feel free to keep putting your thoughts in there. So I'm Betsy Leondar-Wright, and my co-facilitator is Jack Metzger, and we are part of the Working Class Studies Association which is the sponsor of this event. And we host the Talking Class webinar series, which is every other month. We get a guest speaker and host a conversation. So we are very honored today to have as our guest speaker, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who co-authored with Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Movement, the book White Poverty, that you can see the cover there on the screen. So Jonathan graduated from Divinity.
We are not seeing your screen.
You're not seeing the screen?
Correct.
That's very strange.
I was seeing it. I'm not
You're
sure if
seeing
I'm
it.
the only.
There we go.
Okay. Everybody seeing the nice cover next
Yes.
photo there? Okay, good. So yeah, so I was starting to introduce you, Jonathan, that Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove graduated from Divinity School, has authored numerous books on religion and social justice, and is currently the assistant director at Yale University's Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. So welcome, Jonathan. We're so thrilled to have you here. So at first,
Thank you so much.
oh yeah. We just want to hear a little bit more about yourself, your work, and please define public theology for us.
Well, public theology is what any faith looks like in public. And um, I think folks are well aware these days that faith can be directed towards stirring up things in public that aren't very helpful. There was a good bit of attention in the news media this past election cycle on the influence of Christian nationalism. It certainly is a political movement that has influenced the public theology of many, particularly white Christians in the United States. But that is certainly not the only public theology in this land. And Reverend Barber and I and our colleague Ross Pellis came here to Yale a couple of years ago to found a Center for Public Theology and Public Policy that would introduce students who are training at the Divinity School for ministry and in other professional schools across the campus in moral fusion movement building that's rooted in moral traditions that have pushed this country toward the common good ever since the abolitionist movement. So that's the kind of public theology that we love, and there are many sources and many streams, and America heard one of them from the pulpit of the National Cathedral the other day, which has got some attention. So, yeah, pray for Bishop Buddy. She's a friend of ours, and she's catching some heat. But also, I think it's a fascinating moment for the Episcopal Church to have a chance to make it known that there are churches that welcome everyone, especially people who are feeling vulnerable because they're marginalized by folks in power.
Yeah. So you have a religious mission and a public work with the Poor People's Campaign. Can you tell us how you relate those two things?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a part of my own story. I was raised in the Baptist church in North Carolina. I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina. North Carolina's Appalachia. The mountains, stretch on down our way too, over Tennessee. If you ever hear somebody who talks like me, they're from the east side of the mountain. If they're from Tennessee side over across the ridge, their eyes are longer. So they say things like light and bright and, isn't it a nice night? That means they're from the other side of the mountain. So anyway, I'm from the North Carolina side. Actually, my family's only real claim to fame is that my granny, and her people all grew up in Mount Airy, North Carolina, right when a guy named Andy Griffith was growing up there. And he went up to Hollywood and he told the story of the town he had grown up in and renamed it Mayberry. But he didn't bother changing the names of the people that he had grown up with. So we are very proud that our Uncle Otis was the town drunk in Andy's show, as he was in Mount Airy as well. But it's good to be famous for something. So at any rate, that's where I come from. And when I was growing up there, um, you know, a a proper descendant of um, hard drinking and Bible believing people, the two of which often can go together. Um, uh, well, I was in a church, a Southern Baptist church, that was uh, directly targeted by the movement that we now call the religious right, by the um, um, political right of the 1970s that intentionally reached out to use faith in order to try to mobilize white people for a kind of reactionary um, political movement of that era. And the thing I've come to realize is that I didn't realize, and I don't think most of the people I grew up with realized that that was what was happening. But looking back, I can now see that my own uh, desire to get into politics and to get into conservative politics as a young person was really shaped by that movement. And I ended up as a 16-year-old kid in Washington, D.C., paging for Strom Thurmond in the late 90s. And getting kind of close enough to the actual practice of those politics uh, that I could see what was going on. I've sensed a tension between what my Sunday school teachers had told me about Jesus and his teachings and what was actually happening, in Jesus's name in in those politics. So that was confusing for me as a teenager. Uh, I now know that teenagers see things, rather black and white, and it was clear that the two weren't the same. So I didn't want to be part of that anymore. But I didn't know what else I could be part of. So I came back to North Carolina, and at a conference that the governor's office hosted, I met. Reverend Barber, with whom I wrote this book, White Poverty, and whose image you can see there behind me because I'm in the office here at the center. But at any rate, I met him and I heard him articulating a way of being Christian in public that was very different from anything I had heard. So I went up to him at this conference and I said, "Hey, would you come preach at my church?" And he kind of laughed and he said to me, if you get, he looked at this white kid from, the sticks, and he said, "If you get your pastor to invite me, I'll come preach at your church." What he didn't know was that my best friend was the pastor's son. And so, we went home from the conference and had dinner at the pastor's house and told him, how much we'd enjoyed hearing this preacher from Eastern North Carolina. And he invited him to come. And um, we became friends and our churches became friends. And we've been kind of on this journey ever since. But what he introduced me to is a tradition in the South of Christians. And it's certainly been led by Black Christians, but it's been Black and white and Native and Latino Christians who have read the Bible in a way that makes it clear that our personal relationship with Jesus is inseparable from a movement for justice in the world. That the two have to be held together. That was at the heart of the abolitionist struggle. It was at the heart of the civil rights movement, and we really believe it's at the heart of what's needed for a third Reconstruction. Not that in any way needs to be exclusively Christian, but for Christian people like us who read the biblical story, holding that personal relationship with Jesus and all of the, you know. Individual things we do as religious practice and community, holding that together with a social vision for how we live our faith out in public. That's what we mean by public theology.
Beautiful.
Okay. So you've been with Reverend Barber for a long time, right?
My whole adult life. And you can see I've got a few more gray hairs than I used to.
Tell us a little bit about what it's
About
like
30
to
years
work with
now.
him, both as an activist and as an author, as a co-author.
Yeah, how we've come to work together.
Well, what it's like to work with him. I mean, he's a pretty big personality.
Yeah. You know, he is movements require all kinds of people. But you know, he's a unique combination of the preaching tradition that I think has been central to many many movements in this country, but certainly to the Southern freedom movement. I mean, of course, the most famous voice, the voice that we have a national holiday to remember this week is Dr. King. Um, but I mean, I think people don't often realize like what a broad community produced King. That there were, generations of preachers who understood themselves to be storytellers for a community that could shape a vision of resistance. It's actually one of the reasons we're here at Yale Divinity School is that back in the 1930s, the African American students here partnered with Black clergy around the country and scholars in HBCUs to have a conference and to really start a conversation that was about how they could operationalize what they called the militant, nonviolent love of Jesus, um, how they could operationalize that to bring down Jim Crow. And in that meeting and in the group that formed out of that meeting was the president of the college that Dr. King attended. It was his religion professor in his college. It was his chaplain when he got to Boston University, Howard Thurman. So many figures that were formative, not just for him, but for his generation, had been intentional for decades about, talking together about what kind of gospel needed to be preached in churches in order to cultivate and ignite a mass movement. So anyway, he's an heir of that tradition of preaching, but also of the organizing tradition of Ella Baker and so many others who said, you know, uh, that that the main thing that needs to happen in terms of organizing is to her famous phrase was shine light and people will find the way, to really trust people and to trust the experience of directly impacted people to form organization and with the resources that movements can give them access to build power from the ground up. So I think of that sort of that great preaching tradition, that organizing tradition, the way Reverend Barber has embodied those has been a powerful witness, and he learned that from his daddy, and he learned it from people that were working together as he was growing up. He talks a lot about being drug along to meetings as he was growing up and listening to a lot of preachers in churches. But you learn from all that. So I've learned a lot from that, and I'm also a preacher myself, but also, as a preacher and as a communicator of the gospel, I'm someone who has both been impacted by and has spent a considerable amount of my time cultivating the written word. And we have for over 15 years now had a relationship of talking back and forth toward the written word. So we talk about it sometimes as the relationship in the Bible, for those of you who know your Old Testament, like the prophets had with the scribes. Jeremiah has a scribe, and Baruch is his name. And Jeremiah tries to listen to the Lord and tries to say what the Lord is saying. And also talks to a scribe about how to write it down. So at least in terms of this book, Reverend Barber is the prophet and I'm the scribe. Although I did appreciate if you get a chance to read it, at the end of the book, he asked me to share some of my own story. So
Right.
he tells lots
Yeah.
of stories in the book about white folks and folks who've been impacted by poverty. And certainly writing those words with him got me thinking about my own story. So I was glad to get to share about my grannies and my own experience there at the end.
Well, tell us that the epilogue that you wrote by yourself is called "How Black Power Saved My White Grannies." How did Black Power save your white grannies?
Yeah, I mean, in one way, it's a way of telling the story of what this book is about, which is to say that when I was growing up, as I was telling y'all, um, people who talked about our faith told us that biblical values meant we should support politicians who, as a matter of fact, were undermining social programs. And uh, we were taught to think about those programs as benefiting other people. And often the rhetoric was that through taxes, uh, poor people are stealing from us in order to support their lives. And there's all kinds of narratives of laziness and addiction. Some people mentioned in the chat earlier, and other myths that are kind of perpetuated to convince people that the poor are other, different from them. But writing this story and reflecting on my own life, it took me back to growing up. My brother and I, we loved spending time with my grannies, and my grannies lived in an apartment complex, kind of across a parking lot from one another. So we ran back and forth between them all the time. When we could convince our parents to drop us off there, we'd just enjoy, going back and forth between these places. And it was kind of our little paradise. And our grannies, who were both widowed by that time, were people who were able to maintain a household. I now realize because they lived in a HUD funded complex, and they were on federal food programs. That good mac and cheese that Granny Taylor made was made with government cheese. And those very programs that were demonized were what sustained that community of love in which I was raised. So in so many ways, that's kind of an example of how we think the myths about poverty have actually uh, served to uh, break apart and diminish many of the communities that would stand to benefit from the kind of organizing and policy solutions that we talk about in the book. So, yeah, that's my own experience.
That's
And it's many policies that benefit everybody are there because of the civil rights freedom struggle.
That's right. Yeah.
And
That's what they don't tell you. That's what they don't
benefited
tell
white
you in
people
the,
greatly.
yeah, in the communities like where I grew up. They didn't tell us that, it was black folks getting the vote in Reconstruction that gave us access to public education. They didn't tell us that it was, in many ways, it was the civil rights movement that had made the HUD funding that,
right.
made my granny's apartments available
Yeah.
and those kind of programs available. So yeah.
That kind of gets to what it seems like is the heart of the book, that
Mhm.
you're arguing there's a lot of poor and low income white people who are made invisible in the talk about poverty and who's poor. And so I'd love to hear you talk about why is that harmful? Is that distorted public discourse? Why is it harmful for what policies we end up with? Why is it harmful for white folks and also for Black people, people of color?
Yeah. Um, one of the things we point to is that this narrative that's pretty widely accepted by many people. Not, it's not just so-called conservatives. Many people sort of assume this narrative is true, that poverty is primarily a Black issue. It's a narrative that developed as part of the reaction against the civil rights movement and its gains, and that that narrative was developed alongside the kind of stigmatizing story that I was mentioning earlier, that says to white people, if somebody else is gaining, you're losing.
Mhm.
And there's various versions of that, but that's the basic story. Um, well, sometimes Black folks have even come into places where they've tried to defend that narrative, because it can be at least presented as if you consider the poverty of other people, that means there's not going to be as much attention or resources devoted to the real experience. And there's no denying racism in reality or in the story that we're trying to tell. A book about white poverty is not an attempt to turn away from race to class, but what we're really trying to do is deepen the conversation about race, and to talk about, why was race really developed as a wedge issue, to split up a potential coalition that could overcome the plantation owners in the beginning, and has continued, although the myth has morphed and has changed in different ways, has continued to be a way of dividing the coalition that together in a democracy would have the power to change the systems such that they could benefit everyone. So, I mean, this is not a message that's original to us. It's kind of been a core message to the Reconstruction movements of this country. And one of Reverend Barber's favorite articulations of it is when Dr. King got to the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. He thinks, and I think he has a great case here, that it's possibly Dr. King's most significant analysis that he offered in the 1960s. And I think likely that it's the analysis that got him killed. But what he says to these folks who've marched across the Black Belt of Alabama for voting rights is, he says, let's look back at Reconstruction, and let's remember that the right to vote was never just about voting for Black folks. The right to vote, and the reason that it was violently destroyed after Reconstruction, was because the wealthy oligarchy of the South realized that as he says in that speech, the poor masses of Negroes and the poor masses of white people, if they came together to form a voting bloc, could fundamentally alter the economic architecture of the country. That's an important analysis. Of course, it's a reading of Reconstruction. It's his understanding of what was happening, and influences, his decision with others to advance a poor people's campaign. And we think it's a kind of central vision for what a fusion coalition has to look like to bring about a third Reconstruction today.
Well,
We may talk about this a little later, but I think just the way people talk about it. I was an adult educator, and it was not unusual for particularly white people, but both whites and Blacks, to think that welfare, which is the term mostly used to cover all kinds of things, welfare was restricted to Black people. And I remember in class one time, a Black woman said, well, yeah, it's just for Black people. When I go to the office for my check or whatever it is, when I go to the then AFTC office, it's all Black people. And a white person who was from Appalachia but is now living in Chicago said, yeah, but when I went to my FTC office, it was all white people. And that was the first time both of them, and many other students, I think this was not unusual, realized this was a universal benefit. It wasn't just for, many white people think welfare is reparations. And so there's just a lack of knowledge, and part of it, I think, is the way things get reported um, by our media as constantly emphasizing race without mentioning, hey,
Yeah.
if we do like Cory Booker's baby bonds, it's presented as reparations, but it would actually benefit more white people than it would black. It's a universal benefit that would be great for everybody, and I don't know why Democrats don't sell that universality versus emphasizing race and ethnicity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. The good news from my perspective is that, we have had um, really powerful experiments in fusion coalition building. I'm sitting here over my shoulder is one of my mentors, a woman named Ann Atwater. I don't know if any of you all happened to see the Hollywood movie that was made about her. It was called The Best of Enemies. She was sort of most known for um, in the 1970s becoming friends with the head of the Ku Klux Klan, even though she was the most militant black leader in Durham, North Carolina, where I'm from, um, because they got they got brought together on a community board that had to figure out, under sort of federal requirements, they had to figure out how to desegregate the public schools. And in that context of, again, kind of like you were describing, talking about their experience, they realized that poor black kids in Durham and poor white kids in Durham were getting about the same educational experience. And that the reason that they weren't able to effectively, petition the city leaders to change that was largely because that they had been pitted against one another. And so this fellow, C.P. Ellis was his name. I mean, literally, he ran the youth corps of the Klan in town, and had invited his young people to be there. He had put the robes on display. I mean, he was a true believer. By the end of a relatively short process, he stood in front of the whole town and tore his Klan card up and said, if this gets in the way of my kids having a better education, then forget it. And that was just a 2-week process, but he and Ann worked together for decades after that. So I think once people have that experience and are able to come together, sort of dispel these myths through experiencing the shared interest, there's real power in that. So that's what we have been trying to do through the Poor People's Campaign, and where Reverend Barber and many others have been very effective organizers, in terms of going into communities, bringing people together, and talking about the issues that impact those communities in terms of who's really benefiting and what could be possible if a broader coalition of poor people come together. We think that is necessarily grassroots organizing, but we also think that in terms of the real political crisis we have in this country, that there is within that a radically different possible future. So I think a lot of folks these days are sort of looking for hope, and I think the hope at the heart of this book, in terms of political futures, is in a chapter on how poor voters are the new swing vote. And I think it's a really important analysis for us to grapple with, especially in this moment.
That's great. And we want to get to the that coalition strategy in a minute, but we first want to look at a little bit at the numbers, like some of why is there such misconception about who's poor, has to do with the definition of poverty, and also with people knowing the difference between absolute numbers and disproportionate numbers. So yeah, Jack made some pie charts.
Well, first, if I can interrupt, I just want to ask, in the book, you make a distinction between the official poverty measure, where about 12% of the US population is poor, and something called the supplemental poverty measure.
Yeah.
And there you find that 140 million people are poor, or 43%. What's the difference? All the numbers we're going to look at are based on the supplemental poverty measure.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those measures, and why is the supplemental poverty measure superior?
Now, thanks for pointing this out, because I mean, we put this pretty early in the book because we think it's fairly central to grappling with poverty as a crisis in this country, which we have failed to do in almost all of our political processes. So, that means, I mean, we're going to talk about numbers and how we get them in just a second, but let me say first, just in terms of impact, because we haven't addressed poverty as a crisis, poverty is the fourth leading cause of death in this country. 800 people died today from poverty. Reverend Barber, who is a preacher and a pastor, often says, if you wanted to just go to the funeral of every person who died today, it would take you a few years, right? I mean, this is the reality of this, and it's, by any reasonable definition, it's of epidemic proportions. When we got to 500 deaths a day in COVID, we said it was an epidemic. This is a national and a global crisis. We have to address it as such. We don't treat poverty that way. And so the question is why? Why don't we treat poverty that way? And a big piece of how we begin to answer that is to say, because we don't even count it, right? The poverty measure, the official poverty measure that the United States government uses, and because the federal government uses it and it becomes the official statistics, it's also what almost every anti-poverty organization ends up using. Those numbers are based on a formula from the 1960s that was developed at the Social Security Administration that just said that the most basic necessities of life can be taken care of if you multiply the cost of food by 3. And, they were looking for a simple way to figure out what the sort of just most basic threshold is. And at that time, if you took the cost of food and multiplied it by 3, it could cover very basic housing. It was an imperfect measure even then, but it was much closer then than it is now. What we've seen in the decade since is a dramatic increase in the cost of housing, dramatic increase in the cost of transportation, dramatic increases in the cost of education, and no effort to adjust that official poverty measure to address any of those things, even as at the same time, real wages have stagnated for most working people and all of those things. So what the state of things is that, by the official poverty measure this year in this country, if you make $15,000 and some change, you're not poor. But we found in a study we did with the Poor People's Campaign that there's not a single county in the United States where you can work full-time at the minimum wage, and earn the $15,000 or $16,000 a year and afford to rent a basic apartment. So we have a poverty measure that that says you're not poor, but you could still be homeless, and unable to feed your family. So this supplemental poverty measure is an attempt to just address the basic issue that we don't count poverty in any reasonable way. And when we use that measure, as Jack was saying, we find roughly 43% of the country. This went down a little bit during COVID because of universal programs that were passed to address the crisis, but it went right back up after those programs were canceled. So we live in a country where 43% of people, nearly half the country, are technically, by the the sort of technical language of these studies, are poor or low income. But we're saying these people are poor. You're poor if you can work all the time, more than full time, and still not be able to have housing, feed your family. That's poverty. And so we are trying with this book to redefine poverty and to say we have a poverty crisis that is that is, not only killing individual people, but is also deteriorating the basic structures of our common life because we haven't even been able to name the poverty that's real.
Yeah, okay. The pie chart has been up for a while, and what it shows is how many people are poor or low income by the supplemental poverty measure. And you can see by the pie chart that almost half of them, 65 million people, more than 65 million, are non-Hispanic white. 20, almost 24% are non-Hispanic black, 38%, excuse me, not percent. Yeah, sorry, I confused that.
Million.
24 million are black non-Hispanic, 38 million are Hispanic, and then 8 million are Asian and 2 million are indigenous. So that's a lot of people. That's that 140 million people. Go to the second that slide. This is the same pie chart, but with percentages. And what it shows is that almost half of the poor and low income population is white, and a little more than half is people of color. So you put those two broad categories together, and it isn't what I don't think it's what most people think of when they think of poverty, because that white part is missing. People know that there's poor white people in Appalachia and some other places, but they don't think of white people as being poor.
Yeah, thanks. This is a helpful chart. I'll just highlight a couple things
Yeah.
in terms of what it helps us see. So this pie chart shows you what the coalition of poor people looks like, right? Because that's by percentage
Right.
total poor people in the United States. Now, what it doesn't show us is that, 60% of black folks are poor. So poverty, grossly disproportionately impacts black communities. That's because of racism. So that's very real. But yeah, and so you've got this here. But on white folks here, it would only be 33% of white folks. So as a community, not as many people are burdened by poverty. But if you go back to the pie chart, it shows you that this coalition of poor people who could come together is about half white. It's about 17% black. It's 28% Hispanic folks, 6% Asian, 1% indigenous or native folks. So this is what, the Fusion Coalition looks like. And so as a campaign, the Poor People's Campaign has been trying to organize a movement that looks like this, because that's the people who have the power, if they come together, to make an incredible difference in our political process. Because here's the other thing. I can't. We don't have the charts to show this, but I can kind of imagine it with you. Well, if you see this chart and you say, okay, that's who is poor. If you then go over to political numbers and look at non-voters, right? People who are eligible to vote but don't vote in elections. The largest group in that economic breakdown would be low-income people. So in the most recent election, which people, I'm not going to make assumptions about people's politics here, but most people were either for the Democrat or for the Republican, and people have made a lot over the fact that in the popular vote, the Republican got slightly more votes than the Democrat, but way more than either of them got were the number of eligible people who didn't vote, and the largest portion of that demographic is people who are poor or low income. So if a fusion coalition of people who, frankly, as we've talked to them, don't see anyone in public life that represents them, if even a portion of this pie, and it can be of I'm not saying you cut it in one place, but I'm saying any particular, makeup, it would only take, 10% of this pie that you're looking at to fundamentally change every election in this country if these people had a reason to show up. And that's really the organizing principle of
Right.
Poor People's Campaign.
I want to read something from the chat. Let me go to the next slide. So Lynn wrote, the disproportionality part is often a way of dismissing white poverty. Even 33% of the white population being poor is a staggering number.
That's
So,
true.
yeah,
It's
that's
5
a
million.
lot of people, because white people are so 2/3 of the country.
And just since I gave you the numbers on the other one, just to give you a sense of what the supplemental poverty measure sort of brings us up to, we're talking about a family of four living on less than $50,000 a year. Um, I mean, that's
Yeah.
pretty tight. I mean, a lot of talk about going to the grocery store these days, but I'm telling you, if you if you're trying to feed that many people and keep a roof over their head, there's not much margin there. So we're talking about so by changing the numbers, you also change the face of poverty, right? So often, again, when we've talked about how it's been racialized, but poverty has also been uh, framed as the kind of public homelessness that is, visible on street corners, people begging, folks who are obviously unhoused. We're saying, if you take these numbers seriously, you're talking about the people who work in the Amazon warehouse and sleep in the parking lot at night. You're talking about people who, check you out at the grocery store but can't afford to feed their families, and have to constantly struggle to try to get government assistance in addition to, and those things are, cut and reduced, and it's a constant struggle to survive for many people who are working not just full time, but sometimes working 2, 3 jobs at a time. We're talking about, lots of people in the healthcare professions who are taking care of people, doing care work, sometimes, in-home care work or in facilities, and literally, working full time at that job cannot afford health insurance for their own families.
Well, maybe this is a good segue
Yeah.
over to the remedies. And I love this vision of the fusion movement, the United Poor People's Movement. So it obviously from the book, it's clear that you say focusing on white poverty brings us closer to having a united front for economic and racial justice. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, what we're saying about poverty is that it's multiracial, um, and that it includes white people. you know, and we're not saying focus just on white people who are poor, but we're saying, in a context where poverty has been racialized such that folks think only of people of color when they think of poverty, that when we can bring the voices of poor white people together with poor people of color, uh, we have the potential to both articulate the scale of the problem and build a coalition that can address it. So that's really the approach that we're encouraging, and we're rooting it in the history of coalitions that have come together and that have been able to have real wins when they brought Black and white folks together. I mean, we spend a little time with these fusion coalitions that, emerged in the South after the Civil War. It's been an important kind of learning community and time period, historical period for us, and a piece of our history that we often forget, how many Southern legislatures, state legislatures were really redefined by white and black folks who came together. Abe Lincoln, the Republican, had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He, became a sort of martyr for freedom in the imagination of people. So black folks were Republicans. But Republicans on their own in the South knew they couldn't win. And so there was a populist movement, and there were populist parties that had organized some poor white folks who realized that the plantation system and its, various political allies were not serving them either. And when those Republicans and the populists formed fusion parties together, I mean, they were literally called fusion parties. Those fusion parties were able to win statewide elections and win control of legislatures in the South. And when they did, the kinds of universal programs that we've been talking about were instituted. They taxed the former, slaveholders, the plantation owners. They taxed these sort of centers of oligarchy, right, of centralized wealth, and they used those taxes in order to guarantee public education to all people. The state I'm from, North Carolina, still has a constitution that, I mean, we operate under a constitution that was written during Reconstruction, 1868, and in that constitution, North Carolina residents are guaranteed a public education. That does not exist in the federal constitution, but it exists in our state constitution because of fusion politics. So that's the kind of coalition building history that we're trying to draw on.
Good example.
Betsy, I'm going to skip ahead. We've only got about 10 minutes of our own time left before the audience. We want to open it up and ask about low-income voter turnout. And then you asked the question about the myth about we can't overcome division.
Yeah.
Okay. Low-income voter turnout, according to the book, has been 20% below higher income voters consistently. Why don't more poor people vote? And what would happen, and you've all kind of already explained this, what would happen if poor folks voted at similar levels to other classes? But why don't they vote?
Yeah, we asked this question when we launched a Poor People's Campaign because we asked it in a concerted survey effort, both asking a lot of people, but also some focus groups. And what we heard overwhelmingly is that poor people don't vote. Not the number one reason was not voter suppression, although voter suppression does target poor people and does prevent some poor people from voting. The main reason poor people say they don't vote is because they don't feel like there's anyone who represents them. And so based on that knowledge, we tell a story in the book of some organizing we did in 2019 in Eastern Kentucky when there was an off-year gubernatorial election there. And there's a strong state-based Poor People's Campaign there that works with many partners in the state, and decided to intentionally engage in Eastern Kentucky, predominantly white communities that traditionally Democrats hadn't engaged. But folks from the city, many Black and Hispanic folks, came out and worked together with poor white folks in those counties to try to talk to one another and then to neighbors about how coming together and addressing moral issues that impact all of them, saying, it's immoral for people not to have access to health care, not to, earn living wages when they work. Those were two central issues. The expansion of Medicaid was a central issue. And in that context, the re-enfranchisement of people who had experienced incarceration and were not able to vote was also an issue. But anyway, people, poor folks of various racial backgrounds, talking together about that and then talking to neighbors about how those policies impact them was important in that. And what we learned in that experience is that people talking to their neighbors about issues has real power. It's limited though, because, one-to-one, word can only spread so fast. What we also saw in that case was that one of the candidates for governor, the challenger, he was challenging a a MAGA Republican who was supported by Trump, um, very intentionally embraced the language that these groups were using, embraced the moral language, embraced the policy issues that they were saying, and in that election, surprisingly, won a pretty narrow victory. What was even more interesting is that after he won a narrow victory and got into office, he actually followed through on those issues that had been central to those campaigns. And the next cycle around, he won with a much wider margin than he had had in his initial victory. So it's an example, I think, of both the power of this kind of organizing and how this organizing really needs candidates who agree to embrace the vision, right? When those two marry together, there's a kind of possibility to amplify this, and again to address the basic concern that came out from the survey work we did, which is that in order to be motivated to vote, poor and low income people need to hear someone speak to the issues that impact them.
That's great. Jack,
I'll just say briefly
Yeah.
that we published the book this past summer,
Yeah.
and we had an event around it at the DNC in hopes that the Democrats' presidential campaign would embrace this narrative, and in every way that we could, said to them that we thought it was essential to their victory. Unfortunately, as you all heard and saw, they decided to embrace a message that was directed at the middle class. And I mean, these decisions get made for all kinds of reasons, but we think that the mobilization of this electorate that didn't show up depends on candidates who are willing to speak directly to these people about the issues that we're saying matter.
Okay. Betsy?
Or I was wondering if you wanted to ask about Michael Zweig's book, Jack. I know that was one of the questions you wanted.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time, and I want to get to the various links and things that we have.
Okay,
But
yeah, I'll put the
it's a good. We might get a little over the a founding text within working class studies is Michael Zweig's The Working Class Majority, and in it he says the poor should not be considered as a separate class, and that poverty is something that happens to working class people, a large segment of which is in and out of poverty over their lifetimes. This is sort of just a semantic difference, but there seems like an alternative organizing approach from yours. Is that the way you see it? I'll remind Michael is part of the Poor People's Campaign in New York, the New York chapter.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful for Michael and his work, and I don't think there's a huge tension. I mean, I hear what you're saying as a summary, and I mean, I think it is true that to talk about poor people as separate from working people is a false dichotomy. But our Poor People's Campaign has very much been about poor working people and poor people whose work is not in any way acknowledged by the economy as it exists. I mean, I think that's an important piece of that to always remember too. There are always people who are doing care work that's not compensated, that are doing other kinds of work, or people who are disabled in ways that they may not be able to do income earning work, but how all of us in community are still people who belong to one another and who contribute to our communities. So yeah, we often use the language of poor and working people. I don't know exactly semantically what's best. Poor working people, poor and working people, but I take his point, and I think it's an important one.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more about how people can get involved in the Poor People's Campaign?
Yeah, it's the Poor People's Campaign, A National Call for Moral Revival, is the full title, was relaunched. It's not exactly the same as the campaign, of course, from '68, and we tried to learn from people who were involved in that, people who've reflected on that campaign. And a few things is, we rather than have a single focus on bringing people to Washington, D.C. and, shutting down the center of the government until poor people's concerns are addressed, which was kind of the strategy in '68. Rather than that, we've tried to have state-based coalitions that are permanently committed to collaborating among, many organizations. This is the kind of fusion approach, people who are organized around different issues and from different communities, permanently committed to working together towards a oral fusion coalition in their state. So much of the attack on um, uh, programs that would benefit poor people and on even the sort of democratic tools that are needed to advance the policies that we think we need. So much of the attack on that has happened at the state level in recent decades. And so we think it's incredibly important to have state-based coalitions that are focused on state government and what's happening at the state level, and then coordinating to have an agenda together nationally and to propose real policy solutions at the federal level. So most immediately, you can join the campaign by joining your state's campaign, and there are coordinating committees in each state that you can reach out to through the website. But then also, if you're interested in the kind of long-term vision that these coordinating committees are working towards, particularly at the federal level, we were able to work with members of Congress a few years ago to introduce something called the Third Reconstruction Resolution. And it's a resolution that's not one piece of legislation, but rather outlines the kinds of legislation that would be needed to bring about a genuine third Reconstruction in this country. And while a vote for the Third Reconstruction Resolution wouldn't bring all those things to pass, it would demonstrate that your particular representative in Congress is committed to pursuing this. And so it exists now as a resolution that's there and to kind of, for poor people and working people and, people who support a movement for a third Reconstruction to really, ask representatives and candidates for those, federal offices, do you support this vision?
Beautiful.
Okay, before we open it to the audience, I was gonna ask a question about the role of unions in Poor People's Campaign. We don't have time for that, but I do want to make a plug for the SEIU guide that you can get. It's a brief, like a reader's guide. It's meant to go used along with the book, but it can be used instead of the book if and I think it's both good for labor educators will love it, and I think will use it, but it's also handy for undergraduate education, as many of our working class studies members are. That's what we do.
Yeah, no, I'm very grateful for it, and thanks for making it available to people here. The SEIU had a reading group that read the book early on, and I met with them, and we had some great conversations. But they developed this, on their own. They developed it for their organizers around the country, and are happy to share it with anybody who's SEIU has supported the kind of inside organizer model. So there's sort of the possibility of anybody becoming an organizer, and we have some real movements along those lines happening. So yeah, it's available as a resource, and glad it's out there.
And I just wanted to make the plug for the fourth resource listed on this slide of Showing Up for Racial Justice. I see as compatible with this book and with the Poor People's Campaign, of similarly reality-based and visionary race class analysis. So they're doing a great job organizing white people to become part of mixed race coalitions that'll move us all forward. All right, we want to open.
It's really helpful. Thank you for putting those up, Betsy. They're because they're on a slide, somebody can't just click it. So if somebody has those and wants to drop them in the chat, that would make them clickable.
Right, that would be good. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna deputize my partner, Gail Leondar-Wright, to try to take them off the slide and put them into the chat. But you're all gonna get these, you're all gonna get the recording link, so I'll make sure you get those links when you get that. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so what questions do you have for Jonathan? And we have suggested discussion questions. In particular, it would be great to hear hopeful thoughts that this discussion is inspiring in you, like what would be different if Americans knew the actual facts about poverty in the US? What would be different about unity among working class and poor people of all races and cultures? Any hopeful thoughts about what politics would be like if more poor people voted? Feel free to type in the chat and also to unmute yourself. I think we could have some people unmute yourself and speak verbally.
I have to speak. I'm sorry I have to speak. I've been involved in a movement all my life. I live on a Section 8 voucher. I come from a working class family and that also had poor people in it. And I'm poor myself. I'm like old, so I just have the Social Security. That's it, And I was active for many years, on the board of the tenants union in Seattle, all these meetings. And I still vote. I've become so hopeless because of the way the movement in this city, anyway, addresses poor white people. It is totally controlled by a lot of highly educated, and I have an education. I went to college and everything myself. I'm not stupid. I read The Atlantic. I've read Betsy Leondar-Wright's books, all of them. I've been to her workshops in the past. There was a lot of flaws with class action, but I want to talk with you. I want to have coffee with you when you come to Seattle. I'm tired of going to workshops and then we don't build the meaningful relationships afterwards, the one-to-one social networking. I've done that. I had a Democratic precinct caucus. I organized a public housing building that I lived in to do the precinct caucuses, back when Kucinich. And I just want to say that, Betsy, I know you identify as class privilege.
I am.
Poor higher white people, they treat us like garbage in the movement. They expect us to do unpaid work. They set the agenda. In Seattle, they want the whole movement segregated, right? And it's one of these things like if you're white, you're a white ally. And if you're a person of color, you're centered, right? And in my social networks, because I lived in public housing and everything, most of my social networks are based on class and like immigrants, Black people, and we share this more, I share more commonality with my neighbors on this block than I do with some rich, arrogant white movement person. And I will stop talking.
Okay,
but this is a problem.
No, it's great to hear it from someone experiencing it. Does anyone have a response to Lynn or to the questions that we asked?
Let me just say real quickly, Lynn, thank you. And part of what you're pointing to, I've learned, I've spent a good bit of time in prisons, and I've found that people in prison are better at building fusion coalitions than folks on university campuses. And part of the reason is that, kind of like you're saying, there's a real clear sense that we're all in this together. And if you're Black or white or a native person or whatever, you got to figure out how to come together in order to survive for one thing, but also to get anything done. I do think as much as our, individual experiences and the experiences that are shaped by particular, um, uh, backgrounds and the ways that communities have been, separated and had different experiences. As important as it is to hear those things, it's also really important that we have spaces to come together and to talk about our common problems. So it is a challenge for, as you said, the movement, but also just for our democratic experiment. One of my teachers, Vincent Harding, used to say, um, we have to remember that our experiment in multi-ethnic democracy in this country is very young. Um, he was saying this to me when he was in his 80s, and he said, we've only been trying it for half my life in a genuine way. So we've got to learn the practices of listening to one another, recognizing difference, but also recognizing, our common interests and ways that we can pursue those together right at the community level. That's what you're speaking to, and I appreciate that. Your frustration is warranted.
Who else has a,
Can we go back to faces?
yes, yes.
Yeah,
Face.
your face.
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, but let's hear from more people. If you have questions for Jonathan or you have opinions or, okay, Sam Coleman, and feel free to unmute yourself.
Right. Thank you so much. First of all, thanks so much for this superb presentation and discussion. This is water on parched land. What can I say? I'd really like to ask, so far, how is this message coming across on university campuses? I know on my own, and I've been griping a little in the chat in the meantime, that so much otherwise progressive energy has been stovepiped into ethnic and racial issues that people aren't talking across them to each other. And so much of the leadership, as it were, is fixated on white supremacy. How's it going? Making any headway among university intellectuals?
Well, I teach on a university campus and visit them often. And in those spaces, I try to listen to the students in terms of what what their hopes are and what like most concerns them. And I guess what I'm hearing from students is a deep longing for something that can unite and a frustration with some of the, and again, it's not that the attempts to hear the experiences of people from various backgrounds, I don't think people are frustrated with that. I think young people have become frustrated with the ways that can just stifle conversation or direct it only to the individual's experience and never get to uh, the conversation about what we share collectively and what we might be able to achieve collectively. Um, so um, yeah, I mean it's interesting to me, for example, that here on the campus where I am, uh, the head of the LGBTQ center often says, my pronouns are all y'all, that kind of thing. But I think there's a sense that like people want to people want to say, whoever you are, you're welcome here. And like, let's talk about this shared project that in so many spaces feels like it's falling apart. So So there's a deep hunger for, what is it that brings us together? And that's where I think our moral narratives are so essential. When we say moral, we're not saying that any one particular religious tradition gets lifted above another, but we're saying like whatever traditions people draw on, that we have to tap into that, that part of our values that says, my life is about something beyond just me. It's beyond just my own self-actualization. It's about how can for my own sake and for others' sake, how can I pursue a better world? And I don't deny selfishness. I do that for me. I do that for my own kids. But it's also about somebody all the way on the other side of the world. And I find that young people are deeply aware of the interconnectedness of things. I mean, the internet has made this just a part of their reality. The way, um, I mean, social media has huge, huge problems in terms of disinformation and our capacity to know, what's actually true. And it's also true that this generation of people who've kind of grown up with it are deeply aware of things that are happening everywhere and of the just inherent connections between economic issues and climate issues and conflicts in parts of the world and just how all those things are tied together. So
Right.
that's somewhat I hear.
I want to
Thank you.
read
Thank you for that response.
there's a really substantive question in the chat, so I'm going to read Buju your question. What do you think are effective ways to change stereotypes about poverty away from poverty equals Black, instead poverty equals multiracial? I don't think providing corrective information by itself does the job. I wonder if we can see poor people as multi-ethnic. We'll see it more as a universal problem and elicit more empathy and commonality.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. It's a great question that kind of has its answer inside of it. Um, but I'll just say concretely how the Poor People's Campaign has tried to do that is to create platforms where poor people, working people, low income people, low wage people, all those descriptors that we've been talking about, where folks, who, again, back to that pie chart, who look like all those different ways that people present, are together talking about it, right? So um, whether it's a, a local event where people are sharing their experience, or an event at their state legislature where they're trying to speak to their representatives, or we've done some mass mobilizations on Pennsylvania Avenue and had tens of thousands of people in Washington, D.C. It's always, if we're going to create a platform, create a stage, we want people to see the full breadth of what poverty looks like. So that's multiracial, that's gay, straight, and trans, that's, multi-religious, it's,
Right.
it's all of us.
I think the place where my question is coming from is that part of shifting the stereotype is both you're talking about it from the perspective of organizing, bringing people together who self-identify as poor and low income or working class. The other part of it is the people who are observers who either deliberately misrepresent whether they're the elites or whether they're media, misrepresent poor people as only one type. And that's a way of just dividing into us and them. And so I think I guess my question is coming from that place. How do we create a different type of messaging
Yeah.
to shift I'm a social psychologist, so I think of, if I were to create a messaging campaign, what would we need to do when we think of poverty? What's the images that pop into mind? And if the images that pop into mind are people like me, I would feel more empathy, and people like you and people like all of us.
Yeah.
Then the programs have got to be universal.
Yeah.
But if I only think of people like not me, then it's easier to say, okay, we can cut that program.
Yeah.
So that's where my question is coming from. Is both.
Oh, thank you. No, it's a it's a great point. And I mean, we need you and many, many people like you. Because it sounds like, you have some experience in shaping messaging. What you're talking about is public storytelling, right? And
Yeah, that's
you know,
exactly right.
so again, from our experience, like we recognize that and have tried to make it part of communication strategies and the way that cultural arts is always a part of our even our organizing strategy. So we have a cultural arts team as part of the Poor People's Campaign, and Yara Allen leads that. And I should say, just to encourage you all, that there's a great new podcast that she just put out that kind of, creates a space for some of these conversations. It's called A Repairer's Song. You can find it on wherever you get podcasts. But anyway, we need a lot more than we've been able to do, and some other people are doing these things. But like you're saying, I mean, movements need. I mean, in this day and age, movements need movies, they need plays, they need, songs. They need people um, um, to sort of internalize their message and make it. As we say in today's internet culture, go viral, right? But how do you make something go viral? I don't know. I mean, I'm not an
Yeah.
expert in that, but
I guess I'm the person who's the researcher who's trying to translate the research into
yeah,
social impact. So
yeah,
I put something in chat for you and all of you here who's
Yes.
interested, because what I want to do is to try and shift the mind and then behavior
yeah,
into something that has an impact on the ground.
yeah,
That's
Um,
great.
yeah. I think that's brilliant. I'll just say real quickly, if so, we teach movements here, so I'm always inviting students to look back at movements. And just on your point, I think like one of the key pieces of people who have ended up being central leaders of every movement is a way that, and I don't know exactly how this is cultivated, but somehow key people in each moment have recognized the power of a particular medium. And so like when I ask students to think about like, why was Frederick Douglass obsessed with the photograph? He's the most photographed man of the 19th century, right? He somehow immediately understood that asserting the dignity of people who had been enslaved meant they needed to be presented in photographs. And in a similar way, Dr. King understood the power of television. He understood if we have to get certain things on TVs, this box is now in everybody's house. They turn it on in the evening. Like, how do we get it there in front of them? And, I don't know how you master this, but somehow we've got to, have an analysis of how we're living now, how people are internalizing the stories of the world, and how do we get this image that we're talking about in front of people? If you can help us answer that question, it would be a great gift.
I'm gonna bring in another question from the chat. Jeffrey Caboso, who's the president of the Working Class Studies Association, the sponsor of these webinars, says, "Thank you, Jonathan, for your reflections on campus politics. I've noticed that the dominant discourse among my students is one that reduced social justice to individual identities or individual experiences such as microaggressions.
Mm.
What strategies does the Poor People's Campaign use to reach working class youth?"
Well, that's a great question. I would say on the organizing side, our biggest strategy for reaching working class youth is through people who are organizing low wage workers. I mean, we're reaching them, at the Starbucks where they're working, at the Dollar General where they're working. These kids are working and they're getting paid next to nothing, and they know there's no future for them earning these kinds of wages. So I think like they're organizing themselves, frankly. We've learned a lot from them. I just read, it's not out yet, but Jazz, who helped start the Inside Organizer School that helped create the Starbucks campaign, and a couple of others now I think have come out of that. Has written a kind of memoir of how that came to be. I think we need more of those stories to come out, and for people to kind of wrestle with the just kind of nitty gritty realities of people who are doing low wage work and at the same time, using every extra minute they can find to figure out how to organize themselves. Um, So yeah, on that side, I would say that in terms of how we're trying to teach, we've been developing a curriculum here, and um, what we really believe is that people will find their way when they understand that they're part of a tradition. So we really are trying to immerse students in the like very concrete issues that abolitionists were grappling with in the midst of their struggle, that, early labor organizers were grappling with. Um, and by sort of walking through that, we do our main intro course to uh, moral fusion movements in America. We do it as a kind of historical survey, but really trying to dive into um, the fact that like people have grappled with all of these things. The particular challenges change over time, but you begin to notice some patterns in terms of um, what people have learned. So um, we think introducing people to that and trusting them to exercise their creativity and wisdom as they understand themselves as sort of heirs of that tradition is yeah, the best way to invite young people into it.
All
I
Which
right.
I
don't
know is
want to,
something that many of you do too. So I'm grateful for that.
somebody has to say something to the young people. I don't want to cut in again. I used the word poverty once in a discussion, and they accused me of hurling microaggressions in the meeting because they do not want to talk about class. All the organizing here, and I think it's also on college campuses today, you have to be on a center particular identities. And if you go outside of that, I can't believe they don't want to acknowledge the existence of poverty. And but to be called the word poverty being called a microaggression, I'm not lying. It's true.
Thank you, Lynn. Coming to the end of our time, and I think we want to put lots of appreciation for Jonathan into the chat, if we can do that now. And yeah, we're just so appreciative of what you've brought us here, Jonathan. It's
I mean, let me just say to all of you, I'm grateful for your association. Thanks for the invitation to be with you. But just that you're continuing to gather and to talk about these things. It's encouraging. We've got to trust that continuing to build the conversation over time will create. We are able, if we can co-create the knowledge, to create the future that we need. That's what I've learned from the past and what I really do believe. And I just want to finish by saying, as a word of hope, a lot of people I talk to these days aren't very hopeful. One of the things I've learned in movement work is that things can look really bad, but when things look the worst, often it's a testament to the power, or at least the potential power, of movement building, because extremists really ramp things up when they feel threatened. And I don't think we would be seeing the kinds of things we're seeing at the federal level right now if some people didn't realize that the kind of organizing and work that you all are committed to has the potential to radically reshape this country. So, as Reverend Barber often says, let your opposition be your confirmation. The, if you feel something pushing back, no, you're probably moving in the right direction.
beautiful.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you. Blessings.
Yeah, so I wanted to just make sure that we announce the next Talking Class webinar of the Working Class Studies Association. We're going to have Professor Allison Hurst talking to us about on March 13th about sociologists have class 2. And I think that's going to be another great opportunity to talk about class. We will send out the recording and the links, including the ones that I'm sorry I messed up, but you can see the recordings of this and other past Talking Class webinars at classmatters.org/events. So yeah, we're kind of building a sense of a real network here, a real community. Thank you to everybody who shared, whether that's in the chat or the or verbally. And yeah, we had a good conversation. And especially thanks to you, Jonathan.